They told us the forge assessment ran in 3 stages. 3 stages, clean and ordered, each one harder than the last, as if knowing the shape of a thing made it survivable. I'd been at the Academy Velsorek for 11 weeks, long enough to know that the forge was where the intake pool thinned. 17 cadets from the previous cycle had requested reclassification to non-field tracks before the 3rd stage ever started. The instructors didn't call that washing out. They called it self-assessment. The distinction mattered to them. It didn't mean much to the 17. My name is Rin Adley. I was 16 on the day of the forge. Brown hair that needed cutting, bunk in the back corner of intake hall 4. The only human in my cohort of 31. The Academy had a bilateral exchange agreement with the Terran Directorate, 1 slot per cycle, probationary status, full curriculum. They filed us under developmental enrollees. A polite way of saying they expected to learn something from having us there, but didn't expect us to graduate. The Forge Annex was at the far end of the compound, a low, wide structure with no windows. The kind of building that didn't need them. The air inside smelled of animal heat and recycled atmosphere, and something underneath, both that I couldn't name, but recognized anyway. I'd grown up on a working property outside Dunedin. My mother raised livestock. I knew what a beast enclosure smelled like before whatever the beast smelled like got layered on top. Assessor Keth ran the forge. Not an instructor exactly. It was the monitoring and evaluation system for all live creature assessments at Velsorek. When Proctor Donveries explained it at our briefing, she described it as a precision instrument. She had the flat delivery of someone who had given the same speech many times and no longer felt the need to inflect it. Assessor Keth grades on 3 criteria, she said. Threat recognition speed, physiological stress response, handler response quality. 3 criteria, sequenced. The first specimen enters when the candidate is in position. The second enters when Assessor Keth determines the 1st stage is complete. The 3rd enters when the 2nd stage is complete. If a candidate fails to meet threshold on any stage, the assessment ends. The record shows where it ended. Nobody asked what threshold meant. Nobody wanted to hear the number out loud. The first specimen for my assessment was a Dranic coiler, a quadruped about the size of a large dog, with banded musculature and a resting threat display that involved spreading the neck plates flat and pushing air through its secondary larynx in a sound that sat at the lower edge of human hearing. You didn't so much hear it as feel it behind your back teeth. I walked into the assessment pen. The coiler was in the far corner, plates out, sound going. I stood still for a moment and looked at it. Then I crouched down and held one hand out, palm up, fingers loose. Not because I'd been taught to, because it was what you did with an animal that was reading you. You made yourself smaller, and you gave it something to smell. The coiler crossed the pen in about 4 seconds. It pushed its nose into my palm, sniffed along my wrist, and lay down. Somewhere above the pen, in the monitoring station, Assessor Keth was processing this. I didn't know at the time exactly what it registered. I found out later when Proctor Donvery showed me the assessment log. Stage 1, the record read, threat recognition, immediate. Physiological stress response, not detected. Handler response quality, unclassified. Not failed, unclassified. The second specimen entered before I fully stood up. A Velhero, a 6-limbed arthropod about the length of my forearm, with chelicerae that the briefing documents had described as capable of structural material penetration. The arthropod equivalent of a very focused can opener. The other cadets in cycles past had apparently spent most of stage 2 trying not to move, which was reasonable because the Velhero's threat detection ran on motion. The standard handler approach was stillness and slow retreat toward the pen wall. The Velhero hit the floor of the pen and oriented immediately. Not toward me, toward the coiler, which was still lying beside my left boot. The Velhero read the coiler as a territory presence and went into warning posture, chelicerae out. I stepped between them. It's not a thing I thought through. The coiler had been relaxed for 30 seconds, and I wasn't about to let a second animal spook it into a stress response that would end my assessment. I moved in front of the Velhero, put my hand flat on the floor between them, and made the sound my mother used with agitated animals. Low, repetitive, nasal. Not words, just rhythm and frequency. The Velhero oriented to me instead, climbed up my arm to my shoulder. Sat there. I looked up at the monitoring panel. I wasn't looking at anything in particular. I just needed somewhere to put my eyes. Assessor Keth's log for Stage 2 read: threat recognition, immediate. Physiological stress response, not detected. Handler response quality, unclassified. Again, unclassified. The third specimen was the reason 17 cadets from the previous cycle had filed for reclassification before the stage ever started. The Veth crawler had a pen of its own at the back of the annex. Not because it needed more space, but because it needed the separation. Velsorek's apex specimen. The Academy had owned one for 60 years. In that time, it had accepted contact from 11 individuals. 3 had been professional xenofaunal handlers with decades of field experience. The other 8 were unlogged, which in Academy record-keeping usually meant the documentation created more problems than it solved. The pen door opened. The Veth crawler moved like water, finding the shortest route downhill. Low and fast, and absolutely certain. It stopped 3 meters from me and looked up. Its eyes were large and pale, and it held itself the way something holds itself when it has decided not to run and hasn't yet decided anything else. The Velhero on my shoulder made a sound I didn't know it could make. I sat down on the floor of the pen, cross-legged, elbows on knees, hands open. The coiler was still behind me. The Velhero stayed on my shoulder. I didn't look at the Veth crawler directly. I looked at the space 2 feet to its left, which is not a human technique for anything. It's just what felt right. The Veth crawler crossed the distance in about 6 seconds. It put one forepaw on my knee, read whatever it was reading, and I settled into my lap. Nobody moved in the monitoring station. I know this because I could see the silhouettes through the observation panel above the pen, and none of them shifted for a long time. Assessor Keth processed for 44 seconds. I know because I counted. When a precision instrument takes 44 seconds to do something it normally does in 3, it has reached the edge of its reference set and is doing something other than retrieval. Proctor Donveries came down from the monitoring station herself. She stood at the pen door and looked at me. The Veth crawler looked at her. The coiler rolled onto its side. The proctor held a data slate in both hands. She looked at it, then at me, then back at it. Assessor Keth, she said, has completed its evaluation. She paused. It has also filed a notation recommending amendment to its own grading criteria. I didn't say anything. The notation reads, she stopped, cleared her throat, continued. The notation reads, handler response quality. Current scale, 1 through 9. Proposed addition, classification 10. Provisional definition pending further case data. Current case filed as reference instance. She looked up from the slate. I waited. You may exit the pen, Cadet Adley, she said, whenever the specimen releases you. The Veth crawler sat in my lap for another few minutes. I didn't rush it. There was no reason to. When it decided it was done, it stood, looked at me once more with those pale eyes, and walked back to its end of the pen with the same certainty it had arrived with. I stood up, brushed off my knees, nodded once to Proctor Donveries. She nodded back. That was the whole of it. No ceremony. No announcement over the compound comm. The other cadets found out the way things always got out at Velsorek, gradually, in pieces, through the people who'd been in the monitoring station and couldn't quite keep it to themselves. What they kept not quite keeping to themselves was the 44 seconds. Not what I'd done, what the machine had needed afterward. That was the detail that landed. Assessor Keth had been grading forge assessments at Velsorek for 31 years. It had never filed a notation before. 11 handlers in 60 years had made contact with the Veth crawler. None while holding a second specimen and keeping a third comm at their back. I didn't tell anyone that I hadn't been thinking about any of that when I sat down. I've been thinking about the Veth crawler's posture at 3 meters, the way it went still the way animals go still when they're deciding, and about the Velhero's weight on my shoulder, which was close to the weight of my mother's gray barn cat, and about the fact that the floor was cold through my uniform and I would rather be sitting on it than standing over anything in that room. I was 16. I'd grown up around animals. I knew how to be calm in a pen because anything else was a good way to get hurt, And I'd learned that young enough that it didn't feel like a lesson anymore. It just felt like sense. Proctor Donvery's filed my assessment that evening. I never saw the full document. What I heard, third hand, through the cohort, the way everything traveled, was that the classification field where the Forge assessment usually populated a numerical score read something else for mine. It read, Reference Instance 1. The proctor, apparently, left it there,